Alright, so for our next look at this book versus movie thing with Stephen King, I figured now it's time to go into Needful Things, which was advertised as the last Castle Rock story, which not exactly true, but it's basically the downfall of Castle Rock. We can say now in retrospect, and typically with this whole book versus movie thing, it's kind of going back and forth, and it's like, this is what the book did, and this is how the movie did it, and so on. That's how we've been doing it. But there's just a lot of fucking book here. So, and there's like somehow they took nearly 700 pages and somehow, some way condensed it into a 2-hour movie. So there's gonna be a lot. There's a lot. Like as far as making changes to what actually ends up in the movie, there's not as much of that as you would maybe suspect, given how much book there is. But I still think I'm just gonna. If you just want to bear with me here, I'm just gonna take the approach of we're just gonna talk about the book for a little bit, and then we'll talk about the movie. And some things might sort of cross over a little bit, but we'll just focus on the very large book to start with, and then we will go on. So, I want to immediately point out the this great opening that the book starts with, where when you first crack open the book and you're reading it for like the first time, you're being spoken to by this stranger that you can't quite identify, but is welcoming you to Castle Rock and basically treats you as a returning visitor, like you've been here before, because we have, if we've read the previous books that were set here. And it's just this very ominous thing where we're being introduced to all the different townspeople and getting the town history, which we know a little bit about. There's so much Cujo referencing and Cujo recap in Needful Things' book. But the interesting thing about being introduced to so many townspeople is it's hard to tell like who's gonna sort of be like who we're gonna get focused on, because there's some characters that might end up being main characters, and there's some characters that are basically extras in this story, and it's like the most we hear about them is just what we hear in this intro. But the how crucial these characters get will obviously come a lot into play as they start to cross paths, because it is one of those cases where it's, I guess you could say the clear protagonist would be Pangborn, but there's also, the focus really shifts and it does become like an ensemble of characters, and this is basically how all hell ends up breaking loose. So, looking at it from the Pangborn perspective and how we see him, because he was in the Dark Half, and then he was in the Sundog, which was the novella that was in Four Past Midnight, and we saw Michael Rooker play the character in the movie version of the Dark Half, which we talked about a while back. So here in the book, this is stuff that didn't even make the movie, but this whole depression and guilt that Pangborn's living with after the death of his wife and son, and the fact that we're constantly hearing his inner voice, and how his inner voice just has this cruelty that just eats him alive, and is always it's such a perfect portrayal of like sort of, I guess you'd say, intrusive thoughts, but also the guilty thoughts are kind of always there at every turn, where like anytime he thinks about not just his wife or his son, but anything that might even remotely trigger some sort of memory or guilty feeling. And it's all just there living inside of his head. And we get to see that like really up close and personal. And the way he talks about like the memories of the car that they ultimately died in. And when he sees like the snake in the can, and how that's like that snake in the can is basically like his son's last happy moment, and he was basically sort of bringing down that happy moment when it was happening, and just stuff like that. And the fact that he, after the events of the Dark Half, like, he started really ignoring his wife and spacing out and doing all that stuff. And it's like anytime like Thad Beaumont would come back up again, everything would just crumble, and it just all kinds of context that the movie was like, we don't need that. So, but it really makes for a very interesting character, especially somebody that's sort of acting as our sort of central protagonist. But we also kind of start off in a place, because typically you might imagine the protagonist of the story being who we start with. And this is a character that we stick with for quite some time, who is Brian. This child who comes across, he's the first person, the first customer for Needful Things when Gaunt gets here. This sort of, he might be a demon, he might be the devil himself. I like how sort of clear yet unclear it is exactly what Gaunt is. And so this introduction where it's a very good technique for us to be introduced to Gaunt through a child's perspective, assuming you don't count, the prologue. So, where it's from our own perspective. But, yeah, so this child's perspective where fear and imagination are both going to be at very heightened states. Because children always kind of assume the most extreme, or have, whether it be fear or imagination or whatever it is, everything is like at a peak. Especially when you're in a strange place or you're meeting a strange person or whatever. And you're always like under the fear that you're going to be punished for something. All of this stuff. Interesting feelings to have when you're meeting who might potentially be the devil himself. And we get outlooks like his fantasies about his teacher and stuff like that. When he has these sort of moments of fear of what will Gaunt do to me if I don't pay my debt and stuff like that. And the fact that this is a child that's basically more or less neglected, I was gonna say abandoned, but his before she even meets Gaunt, he's already feeling kind of at a distance with what little family life he has left. He's got his little brother, but his mom, Cora, is just awful. So she ends up, what's interesting about her is there is that neglected feel, but she ends up being the reason he walks into Needful Things in the first place. Because that thought crosses his mind. And then the way you see how when she gets sucked into it when it goes down the Elvis road, with her and the other woman getting into like this Elvis battle over like the painting and then the sunglasses. And while all of this is going on and she's getting sucked in by this, at this point Brian's like considering suicide over everything that's happened, everything that eventually goes on with Nettie and all that. And it's just this really insanely tragic story, much more so in the book than the movie. In the movie, Brian barely feels like much of a character, outside of the scenes where he's, paying his debt, as it were. And that's about it. Because they pussied out on the suicide angle, as cruel as it sounds to say. But, yeah, but that I feel like Brian is really like this sort of center that really highlights just the tragedy of everything that's going on here, because we start with him, and then when it ends, by the time his own tragedy, his story ends, like, hell is just starting to break loose, and that's just where he's just basically a footnote at the end of this, when he's like one of the most tragic parts of it, and just really highlights what's going on here. But as far as this starting scene when he's in Needful Things for the first time, another thing that King does that's great here is the way he's able to do this thing that might otherwise feel unfilmable, because it's almost like a four-dimensional feeling, where when you touch something in Needful Things, it transports you somewhere else. And there's this something obviously the movie didn't even try to interpret because there was no way it probably could. Just this piece of wood that's from like a boat, and where that takes Brian when he touches it. And it's like not just like this, what he's seeing, but what he's hearing and feeling and all of that. And it's just such this thing that can only really be captured in a book, into where it can take your mind and give you the appeal of what Needful Things is, and what power Gaunt has over these people, and how he pulls them into this trance with these items, and where these items can transport you. And it's really, it's a really wild concept, and it's a great starting point for this story. I do think if we want to get right into this, one problem that the book and the movie suffer from is that this great concept of watching this town crumble by turning them against each other, and when this really the real core of this portion is the Nettie and Wilma Jarzik thing. So the problem with this story, both the book and the movie, I feel, is the way we build that up and how there's such a sort of progressive throwing fuel on the fire sort of thing, and just the war that goes back and forth, like there's this one thing and then this one thing, and their hatred and their resentment, even though neither one of them is actually doing this to the other, is building and building and building. It feels like it builds so well and so effectively, and it just runs so deep, this rivalry, that when we get to the moment where Nettie and Wilma kill each other, it's like, what, a third into the book? It's like halfway through the movie and like a third of the way through the book. And so, while obviously the point is that this is going to happen to everybody, and this is just the starting point, it does feel like both King and the movie built up that angle so well that when it reaches that moment, it reaches a peak that it's kind of hard to continue on from. And so, it kind of feels like it starts to get a little, not, I was going to say directionless, maybe the opposite of directionless, in a place that's almost too clear to the audience too early. Because we get to the point in both the book and the movie where it's this place of, now that it's been established, oh, this person's going to do this against this person, and that's what the concept is. We're just kind of watching it play out. Like, it's not really oh, where is it going to go now? You get the vibe early that it's going to be this for a while, and ultimately the outcome is probably going to be that they all essentially eat each other while Gaunt watches his plan unfold. And then we're just kind of, like in that first third of the book, it really feels like you're in it. Like, it feels like you're in Castle Rock and surrounded by these people, and you know these people, and you're watching just this heated rivalry just get worse and worse and worse until it comes to a head, and you feel like you're just right in the middle of that. And then everything after that, it feels like you're very outside of it, and you're just sort of watching it. You're almost watching it from Gaunt's perspective. And the problem is that Gaunt knows everything that's going to happen. So, that's where I feel like this is. It does feel like a very climatic story. It does feel like King was trying to finish something when he was telling this story. But I do think there's an issue there that the investment feels like it peaked very early with those two characters of Nettie and Wilma. But, because here's the thing. One negative reason as to why characters like Nettie and Wilma and characters like them really stand out, even the Hugh Priest character, and the fact that we eventually get very devoted to what's going on with Keaton, becomes a huge part of the story, especially in the movie, is that we have another sort of secondary protagonist here to Pangborn, and that character is Polly. Polly Chalmers, and I think it was a weakness in the book as well as it is in the movie, and that is, maybe I'm alone in this, I don't give a fuck about Polly as a character, I found. Like, when I'm reading the book, it's like, there's the Keaton stuff, there's the Brian stuff, there's, the Nettie stuff, and the Wilma stuff, even the Hugh Priest stuff. He has an interesting angle where, like, he's the asshole of the town, but then he actually has this moment where he breaks down after he pays his debt. And it sort of humanizes him. And this whole thing going on with him and Brian, where, like, Brian starts off that way, where he was, like, innocent, but then the more he got involved in this, the more it kind of, the more he took pleasure in it, like, this mischievous pleasure in it. And then he reverted back to the guilt until he ultimately killed himself. Whereas Hugh was kind of the opposite. He started off as the asshole, and then he broke down and was humanized, and then he got worse as it went. All of this stuff is so much more interesting. Every time it would come back to Polly, I would nearly zone out. Like, like okay, so she has the arthritis problem. That's basically her main trait, apart from being, you know, Pangborn's new girlfriend. Pretty late into the story, we get this whole thing about how she lost her child and her rocky relationship with her parents and how she ended up back in Castle Rock. And I don't know, just every time I saw Paul, like, there's always those spaces that King does, whether it be that or, like, you know, the little chapters within the chapters. And it's like every time it would come back to Polly, I could just feel it, like the energy just kind of dies. So that's something that, I mean, I guess he tried to kind of make her interesting by, like, making it seem like she was hiding her past from Pangborn and making it kind of a mystery before we finally got the whole layout. But I've just never been interested in Polly Chalmers as a character, and that's pretty detrimental to the rest of the story, given how crucial of a part she's supposed to have. But that's something that I always thought was kind of a weakness. But yeah, I guess another person we can talk about is I struggle to talk about Keaton right now because I said I was gonna talk about the book mainly and then go to the movie, but he's just so perfectly cast, and his performance and everything about him is such a standout in the movie. It almost feels like you can't even talk about Keaton as a character without talking about J.T. Walsh's portrayal of him, because these are two where they're so working in harmony. How the book and the movie came together to make this character sort of, because like I was saying, even the movie seems so like entranced by his character, and it's like, how much bigger of an asshole can this guy be? But also how much more like when his, you know, paranoid rage starts coming in, and he just like is descending into madness, and we're kind of watching this happen in real time. That's something where it feels like he's like one of the ultimate King's side characters, where it's sort of like you almost want him to take over the story because you're so engaged with watching somebody that's this fucking crazy. And it's like you want to see just how much more crazy they can get, because he was already unhinged before Gaunt. Like, he was already this paranoid mess, and just this town bully before Gaunt even got here. And so you add that element in, this is going to be a character that that stands out above a lot of the other characters. And even the physical description sounds like J.T. Walsh in the book, if I remember correctly. So I guess while we're on the topic of him, we can jump to the ending, which is when he... Well, I guess we'll make a detour here, because we got to talk about something that's in the book that is not at all in the movie. And that is a pretty major... I mean, he comes into the book very late, but still, it's very interesting that this is a character that's not in the movie at all. I don't know if they thought it might be confusing because this character already existed in a King adaptation that's not a horror movie, but then again, at the same time, you know, I think this and The Dark Half were the same year. The movies were the same year. And so you have two completely different sort of Pangborns being played by two different actors in two different movies in the same year. I guess that was just... It couldn't have been prevented one way or the other, so as they were, you know, in production simultaneously, practically. So I don't know exactly what the conscious decision was behind not having Ace Merrill in the movie, after Kiefer Sutherland played him in The Body. And in the Body's Kiefer Sutherland plays him in Stand By Me. In The Body, he's the character, and we also kind of get more of an epilogue on him in The Body's story that we didn't hear about in Stand By Me, where he is just kind of, you know, bumming around town and kind of comes and goes, and he's been to Shawshank and done all that stuff. And then he comes back to town at just the right or wrong time in the book, just in time to meet Gaunt and wreak havoc. There is the moment where I believe it's Ace in the book that receives Treasure Island from Gaunt. And somebody does get Treasure Island in the movie, so I guess it's kind of a callback to that. But they more or less make the mass destruction that happens at the end that was done by Ace and Keaton in the book, just a Keaton thing in the movie. But so it is interesting just how crucial a part Ace plays here, and the fact that he also plays a massive part in how Keaton is treated between book and movie, because you have this moment where there after Keaton has killed his wife, it goes in this insane direction where Keaton's now like sporting a blonde wig, he's snorting a lot of cocaine, and he's blowing up bridges with Ace Merrill, and it becomes this whole thing of just pure and total insanity. And the thing about it is, Keaton becomes such a hateable, despicable character, especially once he's killed his wife. And the reason that has much more bearing in the book than it does the movie is in the book we get a lot more of an outlook from Keaton's wife's perspective, where it's like he's always been sort of mean and a bully to her, but there are these moments that make her remember why they fell in love. And so like there's this whole sequence in the book where he's gotten his winnings after the winning ticket game has gotten him his money. And we see this lunch that they have, this romantic lunch they have from her perspective entirely. And she's like crying because she's so happy that she's sitting across from the Keaton that she loves and the Keaton that she married. And it's like, this was what I imagined my life to be. And it's this very tragic thing. So when he ultimately kills her as brutally as he does, it feels like there's no coming back for Keaton in the book. It doesn't matter if he's under Gaunt's power or not. He was always kind of a piece of shit, especially to her, and it's a really brutal moment when he finally kills her, and then just goes off and does cocaine and blows up bridges in a wig with Ace Merrill afterwards. That it almost feels appropriate. That it feels anticlimactic, but it also feels appropriately anticlimactic that his death is so unceremonious in the book, where they've done what they need to do, and Ace just unceremoniously kills him. Just, like, shoots him in the head, and that's the end of Keaton. And it's, like, one sentence that, like, barely matters, because as Ace has taken over as this sort of primary antagonist apart from Gaunt during the climax of the story. And so, like it's insane when you think about adapting this to the screen and not even having Ace's character is such a wild choice. So, talking about... Let's jump to the movie now that we've talked about that, where I think it actually makes sense that you just kill Keaton unceremoniously. Adapting that to have Keaton have this moment of redemption as he blows himself up in order to blow Needful Things up. I don't know. Maybe because I'm more focused on book Keaton, which is more hardcore than... more heartless and soulless in his sort of meanness than the movie's Keaton, if you can believe it. Because the movie, I mean, J.T. Walsh's movie Keaton is unhinged as fuck. Like, let's not downplay that. But I feel like it's getting more of an outlook from his wife's perspective is what makes him irredeemable in the book to me. So, with that carrying over, that you take a character that's more irredeemable in his book form... because the movie does set it more up like he only killed his wife in a Gaunt trance. But I don't know. I never cared for Keaton being the final big sacrifice, and then making, like, "Don't call me Buster" this sort of phrase of honor as he dives into his sacrificial moment, when "Don't Call Me Buster" was always something that made him so pathetic. And you would think that's the reason they'd make it a triumphant moment, but I feel like the character should be seen as pathetic, and nothing else. So that was just that was such an out of left field choice to make Keaton this final sort of heroic sacrifice. I still don't. Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know how I feel about it. I don't like it. That's how I feel about it. So that's a lot of what's going on here. Another thing about the book that's going on here is, like, as far as downsides to the book, especially when we get in that, second half. Not only is it just that Nettie and Wilma's story feels like a peak, like a big dramatic peak, but we start getting the events from Alan's perspective for a while, from Pangborn's perspective. And so, yeah, since he's a cop, it's important for him to get these sort of tedious details. But at the same time, it's all details it's very repetitive for us. Because it's them finally piecing together what we've known we watched it play out from the very first step. And now we have to watch other characters, or read other characters. Start from the very beginning we started at and figure it all the way down, all the way up to what the event was, to the killing itself, and what's going down, and the fact that it's gaunt. And that can be, there's a reason the book is this thick sometimes. Like, there's a lot of great quality in here, and I'm not one of those people that, jumps down King's throat for having long books, because they can be they're still fast reads, even when they're tedious, but, yeah, because you want to talk another thing about tediousness here is, I guess you could say a problem the movie might have is it doesn't feel like it's on as grand of a scale, and that's probably because it has less characters, but that's something where I like the idea of setting, the community up. So you go through all the different, like we do in the prologue, when they take us through, like, all the different townspeople. But the thing about it is, and I know another of King's things is having a lot of characters, like, The Stand is always notorious, or The Salem's Lot has a shitload of characters. And sometimes it can be hard to keep up with all of them. But when we get to this second half of Needful Things, when everything's really starting to roll along with Gaunt's plan, we're just meeting new characters left and right, and this character's given this job to do this to this character, and this is, a lot of times it feels like it's the first time we're hearing about these characters, maybe apart from the prologue, and it's a lot of names, and you really can't keep up with it, and you would think, oh, maybe it's just to show, like, the whole community is going to be doing this, but there's, like, details later where it's like, you have to kind of remember that this person that was mentioned once did this thing to this other character that was mentioned once or twice, and it's a lot. Like, it's real. I have no idea how King would keep track of it writing it, but so that's something that also kind of feels like it winds down the momentum that was going when we have the Nettie Wilma story going on. So there's a point in time, there's two different characters named Henry. Now, I know that's another thing where it's like, yeah, if you live in a community, there's enough people, there's a chance people are going to have more than, like, there's going to be a first name that repeats. Okay, it's realistic, but as a reader that's trying to keep up with all this, you really don't want to give two characters the same first name. That just seems ill-advised, even for somebody that's, as much of a master as King is. That feels like yeah, that's just not something I would do as a writer, I'll say that. So, yeah, it does become hard to keep track of, and then once, like, the church wars break out, it does sort of, like, and it just gets into the carnage, and the characters are dying off left and right in these really wild ways, and it does just feel like this great sort of explosive finale, and then Gaunt just sort of getting away, and flying off in his car, chariot, hell, whatever thing. It is, and then the idea of the epilogue sort of circling back around, and he's in a new town, we get the same introduction, and it's an endless cycle. So, like, at the end of the day, it is a book and a story I really like, but it's that middle portion that gets kind of rough, that we could have kind of taken a lot out of. But I do like the way a lot of things sort of come full circle. Though I did mention there is a lot of needless Cujo recap for no reason. Like anytime he mentions like the Camber place or wherever, all these places we know, it's not just oh, we're in this world and he's built this world and we live in it. And it's this really cool, the whole worlds that King has built that we keep coming back to for all these different stories is amazing and I love it. But it's like we read Cujo. We know all the detail. Like when Ace is out there or Polly's out there or whatever, it's like we know what happened out here. You just have to say it's the Camber place, and we know what happened out here. But we get like full recaps of Cujo right in the middle of Needful Things that we don't need. So there are moments where he gets a bit carried away. And it could be edited down, but it's still I love how wild the story gets. I love the concept of the story. I love the idea of it being a sort of finale for Castle Rock, even though it wasn't really. And I can really appreciate a lot of the things about it. So I do really like this book and this story for sure, even if it has those moments. But it's King. Those moments are going to happen, and we go with it because we love him. So that I guess I don't know how much that leaves to talk about with the movie. I do think there's one change here right away that I think is probably a good one, and that is when we're establishing the community in the opening scenes of the movie, changing the sewing shop to a diner, because a diner definitely feels like much more of this community place and like a place, and it has this small town feel that's just very universal when you're in a diner like that, and it's like to make a sewing shop sort of where some of our main characters are hanging out is very like you can't really do that cinematically, so that was a decent choice. It's worth noting I didn't recognize the director's name and I looked it up and he's apparently his last name is recognizable. He is the son of Charlton Heston and he's directed like 2 or 3 movies or something, and so that's as far as that goes. This is definitely something I feel like did not benefit from one of those here's a random director jobs. Like, I feel like a real visionary could have really done something with this. And while he may be the son of Charlton Heston, I don't know that there was much. It's a very unremarkably shot movie. It doesn't feel particularly epic in the way the story is supposed to until, like, when everything's sort of popping off at the end, then it kind of starts to capture the chaos of the book as much as it can, I suppose. But, I mean, if you bring in the son of Charlton Heston for something that's supposed to be epic in sort of scale, or feel epic in scale, you'd think he'd know a little bit about it. He was on the set of the Ten Commandments as a baby, if I'm not mistaken. I think he played, like, Moses or something, like, as an infant. But I don't... It's just, like take, for instance, the confrontation between Nettie and Wilma. And in the book, it's like in the afternoon, and the sun's like high in the sky, and it's like he treats it like a Western standoff, and it's like this whole sort of cinematic thing. In the movie, they fight in a dark house, and it's I don't know. I guess I can get where it's like, if you wanted to feel like from a grounded perspective, maybe going with the movie's angle is more right, but I don't know. I just love how sort of grand scale everything in the book feels. Another thing they never touch on in the movie is the fact that the book keeps mentioning that it's like the hottest October ever in it. And it took me way too long to realize that that's probably because Gaunt is in town and he's from hell. Because, we're at a place in the climate now where we're like, it's October right now and we're dealing with like 80-degree weather. So it was just like, oh, that makes sense. But no, I guess it's because Gaunt's in town and he's from hell. That makes much more sense as to why this October in the book is so hot. There's not even a reference to it being an unusually hot October in the movie, so there's that. You could have done, having this movie be more sunny while all this shit's going down is this sort of nice juxtaposition that could have been going on. But there's not much of that at all. There is one thing. We talked about J.T. Walsh being the perfect Keaton. I mean, Max von Sydow is Gaunt. that's just one of those things where, was there even another way to do this? Like, it's one of those things where you'd almost think he's such a perfect Gaunt that he would be the choice that was the sought after choice, but he didn't want to do it, or they couldn't get him or something. Like, he was out of reach, so you have to settle for, like, 3 actors down on the totem pole. It feels like the fact that we got a Needful Things adaptation where Max von Sydow plays Gaunt is a perfect miracle. Because there's like no other, like, if they should try this again as like a series or something, good fucking luck finding a, a casting choice for Gaunt that's this perfect. Like, I don't know how else to even, like, I can't even, like, it's hard to even narrow that down into, like, specific thoughts. It's just, you cannot get more perfect than that choice, and that's the end of it. So, there's and the idea of, Father Merrin being, like, potentially the devil now. There's that whole thing, too. But, like, it doesn't even feel like some sort of Exorcist in-joke or anything like that. It's just a perfectly stellar piece of casting that could not and should not have gone any other way. And I'm so glad that we do have this adaptation at least. With all that being said, the one thing I don't particularly care for that the movie did that's a massive change is the fact that it is an ongoing thing in the book that Gaunt and Pangborn are never meeting. Like, they always sort of escape each other, and Gaunt's, like, watching him from a distance because he knows, like, this is going to be the guy that tries to fuck this up. And just every time Pangborn goes to meet him, something supernatural or otherwise puts him in another direction. And so you're kind of anticipating this moment they're finally going to cross paths. And it's like, I don't think it's still the end of... I don't think it's still the climax of the book. I don't think. Unless it was, like, right before that. Yeah, the whole point is that Pangborn and Gaunt are not meeting throughout the book. And the fact that they might be sworn enemies when it comes to the climax. And Gaunt knows this already. In the movie, Pangborn's like one of the first people Gaunt meets. It's like 20 minutes into the movie, in this 2-hour movie, and they just meet pretty casually. And that's... I don't get that. I don't get that choice. I don't... I can't even begin to guess why you would think, oh, it's no big deal. We'll just have, Pangborn and Gaunt in a scene together. They'll meet. Yeah, we'll go around that. I don't get that choice. I can't get behind that in any way, shape, or form. I also, much as I'm praising having Von Sydow in the movie and the fact that you want to use that as much as possible, if I'm remembering correctly also, I feel like we never see Gaunt outside of Needful Things in the book. He's always lurking in there, and we just know he's in there. And that's fucking creepy. It's very well done by King. But he's, like, out and about in town all the time in the movie, it feels like. And it's like, it doesn't give you that vibe. I guess it's supposed to be like, oh, he's amongst them, and this is how he watches over them. The idea that he's just watching over them all from the dark inside of Needful Things is something that has a real atmosphere to it. So I'd almost say, much as I think the Von Sydow casting is perfect, I almost feel like he has too much screen time. Like when he ventures out to the lighthouse or the diner or whatever, or in Keaton's house. Like I love the idea of him only being inside Needful Things until, like, he's leaving at the end. Is like the only time he is. So that's something that really feels like it breaks this sort of great illusion that the book set up, and really set up this sort of eerie atmosphere of just Gaunt being all-knowing without having to leave the confines of the darkness inside that building. So that's kind of a bummer as well. But we do still have these nice touches, though, like the way they change his teeth and his fingernails throughout is something that's, like, really emphasized on in the book that I feel like it's almost done in this more supernatural sense, where it's like people are like, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing with him? And the idea of, like, getting these moments when he's alone, and that's when, like, his appearance changes a little bit. I think that's handled well, and I like the whole, the way they handled the sound, where when somebody walks through the door of Needful Things and the bell rings, and the sound lingers on, like, one note. And I think the reason I love that is it's not something that attention's ever drawn to. It's just something your ear kind of catches in the background. Like it's actually pretty subtly there. So I really like the way that was done. But I'm talking about how a big crucial moment that really sets off the book that I loved was this moment that Brian's in Needful Things, and it's this whole scene that plays out. The movie does something here that I really fucking hate. In when movies do this, because you'll notice a lot of the best movies know when to stay in a moment. And so I love long scenes. As long as they're engaging, I love long scenes in movies. And when you read the book, this is a nice long scene of Brian inside Needful Things and, going through things, being pitched by Gaunt, and then the baseball card comes up. Sandy Koufax in the book, and, of course, Mickey Mantle in the movie for whatever reason. And so, the thing about this is, when this first scene where we're being introduced to Needful Things as a setting and what it is, and Gaunt himself, we're cutting it up. We're cutting back and forth between Brian here for the first time in Needful Things and Pangborn proposing to Polly at the diner. And it's like, if you really wanted to set a tone and an atmosphere and a feel, you'd let this Brian scene happen uninterrupted. And it's like, I feel like that would have been such a great scene if you just didn't interrupt it or cut into it. Just let it play out. You could have done a lot of scenes like that in this movie, and there's really none of that. Because it's got, 700 pages to tell in 2 hours, and that's going to cause problems, so there's a lot of cutting around, and that's something that I feel like could have made the movie much more engaging. However, there are also times where, especially if you're familiar with the book enough, the movie might catch you by surprise. You might think it's overkill, and maybe it is, but I like being caught off by surprise by the way Raider is killed. That was an insane change. And you would think, King in the book, with all these pages and his imagination and all his morbid qualities, would have really conjured up something brutal. Hugh just comes in and stabs Raider in the book. He stabs him and leaves the note there, and that's it, if I remember correctly. Whoever's call it was to have him skin and hang Raider to where Raider looks like this monstrous blood creature when Nettie opens the door. I don't know if it's enough to say good call, but I will say you got our attention. So that's always being confronted by something like that, especially as a book reader when you're not expecting something. If it's not too crucial of a change that sort of fucks up the vibe or the atmosphere or whatever, that can be appreciated. To kind of say, oh, you were expecting this, well, how the fuck is this? And then that's something I can get behind. So that's fun. It's disgusting and disturbing and maybe too brutal, but fun as a horror fan, I suppose. So, yeah, and then we get, all the church thing is kind of more in the background, but it does feel like that's something that might have possibly been sacrificed in an adaptation, but I think they built it up enough that it feels right when we're getting towards the climax and the church wars kind of start to happen, even though it feels less like the church wars in the movie and more just the chaos in general, which I can get behind that, because at the end of the day, it is just supposed to be all chaos. And like I said, with this, they only had so much they could do, but, in, the confines of the movie versus the epic nature of the book, but that chaos at the end is fine. Ed Harris has a nice big moment here where he gets to call out God in front of everybody and kind of change everybody's mind. I don't think there's much of anything like that in the book that I remember, at least not to the scale that basically the climax of the movie is just Ed Harris rounding up the townspeople and saying, "What the fuck is wrong with all of you?" I think that's a good scene, and to get a character, or to get an actor like Harris who has a commanding presence like that and that voice, to where it's believable that Ed Harris could tell an entire town what the fuck is wrong with you, and they listen. So that's another piece of casting that I think works very well. I'm sure Rooker probably could have done that too if we carried over from the Dark Half, but yeah. So yeah, I didn't really say anything about that specifically, but yeah, I like the idea of Harris as Pangborn a lot too. I just I would have loved to have seen Harris, who is such an incredibly capable actor, doing all of the depression and guilt stuff with the mother-son thing that we completely cut out of the movie. That could have been much more interesting for the character as well. But again, we only got 2 hours, so I guess that's about all I really have to say about these, I guess. So yeah, so I summed up my thoughts on the book. The movie, the movie obviously feels very underwhelming, very watered down if you know the book well, but if you don't and it's just the movie, I do remember I saw the movie at kind of a younger age, maybe I was like 13 or something, and I just wasn't into it. I just didn't vibe with it, and by the time I watched it again after I read the book, I had basically forgotten. Like, when I was reading the book, I didn't remember barely anything. So when I watched the movie again, it was basically like another experience. So I guess it's you almost need the book for the movie to be more memorable than it is, I guess. Because like I said, because like atmospherically and visually and just the whole vibe of it is so unremarkable. When it's something that like it's a story that works on basically all vibes and atmosphere. So there's a lot of things lost in the movie, but it's not a completely lost cause because we got, like I said, Harris as Pangborn, Von Sydow as Gaunt, and J.T. Walsh as Keaton. And the fact that two of those actors aren't with us now just shows that there's. I'm glad this movie exists for a few reasons. Amanda Plummer, I didn't even mention as Nettie, is also perfect as well. Where I would think, I felt like she felt more normal in the book. But so like it almost feels like she's a bit too ticky in the movie, but I still think Plummer mastered that enough that she still feels like a very real and sympathetic character, even if she feels a little more heightened and theatrical in the movie than she does in the book. So I'm fine with that also. One thing I also left out was the choice the movie made of her putting up the tickets throughout Keaton's house. Where when I mentioned when he was out to lunch with his wife, I think is when she does it in the book. So the idea to heighten the suspense by having her do it in the movie while he's home, it's a pretty cool choice also. So I can get behind that. But other than that, the movie leaves so much to be desired once you've read the book, and the book itself leaves some to be desired also in those middle portions. So whatever that says. But I'm going to go ahead and leave this at this, and we've got one more of these. Like I said, I'm still reading the book for the first time, so it's going to be really, really crammed in here, if I can pull that off. And then we will do more of the straight-to-video stuff and all that. We're getting into, like, the last week of the month here now, and I got behind a week, so we're going to kind of be squeezing things in here all at once, but we'll get there. So until the next thing, I think that's it.